Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Steve Villee, and I'm going to be talking about Occam's razor and how it might be applied to the phenomenon of poverty.
Will you explain Occam's razor before you go into that?
I will. Check it out. Come on. Okay, we did. Okay.
Oh boy.
All right. For those who may not be familiar with Occam's razor, it's a principle that says when there is more than one possible explanation for something, the one requiring fewer assumptions is preferable. It's devised by this guy, William of Occam, who lived long ago. Some people paraphrase this as the simplest explanation for something is usually correct. Keep in mind, though, Occam's razor just says that an explanation is preferable. It's still not necessarily correct. So the way I might put it is the simplest explanation for something in the sense of requiring fewest assumptions is worthy of serious consideration. Okay. One of the classic examples of Occam's razor is the Copernican model of the cosmos, which says the sun is at the center. Wait, this is the heliocentric model here. Prior to Copernicus, the prevailing view was that of Ptolemy, who said the Earth is at the center. So that's the geocentric model. Now, one of the challenges with the geocentric model is if you look at any one of the planets, it usually goes across the sky in one direction, but at certain times, it seems to go the other way. This is called retrograde motion, and Ptolemy came up with these epicycles to explain this. And so what Copernicus was saying was, you know, if we just say the sun is at the center, things are much simpler. We don't need these epicycles. The apparent retrograde motion is just due to the fact that both the Earth and the planet in question are separately revolving around the sun. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about poverty, and I'm referring to absolute poverty, so I don't just mean inequality. I'm talking about destitution, inability to meet basic needs like food, housing, and health care. Measuring poverty can be a tricky thing, especially when you're trying to compare one country to another. Each country has its own poverty line or poverty threshold, reflecting that government's estimate of what it typically costs to meet basic needs in that country. The World Bank is a United Nations organization that tries to fight poverty worldwide. Mostly they loan money to poor countries. But one of the other things they've done is they've devised these two international poverty lines, $1.25 a day and $2 a day. So I'm just going to go over these really briefly. $1.25 a day is a replacement for what used to be $1 a day. This is normally considered the threshold for extreme poverty. What it is the average of the 15 poorest countries' poverty lines. So by this standard, the poverty rate among all developing countries dropped quite a bit from 1981 to 2011. And most of that reduction happened in this top region here, East Asia and the Pacific. And most of that was due to China, which, as you guys may know, has experienced quite a phenomenal economic growth over the last few decades. In contrast, this bottom region here, sub-Saharan Africa, showed hardly any improvement. Statistically, no change over the 30-year period. And if we look at individual countries that are still showing fairly high levels of this extreme poverty, there's certainly a concentration in Africa, but they're not all in Africa. They're kind of spread all over the world. Here I've chosen one example from each of those 6 regions, and this is just to show you how widespread poverty is. Okay, the other of these international standards is $2 a day. This is, you might call this the threshold for moderate poverty. It's the average of the poverty lines in all developing countries, so there's about 75 of them. Okay, again, by this standard, there was a reduction, not quite as much. And here, it was the top 2 regions that had most of the reduction. So again, East Asia and the Pacific, also Europe and Central Asia, quite a bit of reduction there. But the bottom 2 regions still have quite a bit of poverty. So once again, Sub-Saharan Africa, hardly any change. Also South Asia, which is India plus the surrounding countries. still have very, very high levels of poverty by $2 a day standard. And again, if we look at the those same 6 countries under the $2 a day standard, all the poverty rates are well above 20%. Most of them are above 30%. So the point here is just, 2 things. Poverty is pervasive. It affects a lot of countries all over the world. In fact, really every country has some degree of poverty. The other thing is poverty is persistent. In sub-Saharan Africa, as we saw, South Asia, and in certain other countries, poverty sticks around despite great effort being applied to try to fight it. And this is nothing new. Poverty's been around for thousands of years. People have been trying to fight poverty for thousands of years. So, of course, people wonder why. Why is there so much poverty? What is the cause of poverty? So I'd like to start with a general observation about causality, which I'm going to illustrate with a little demonstration here. I have this book, which I'm going to put on this chair, and now I'm going to make a prediction. Over the next 5 seconds, this book will levitate off the table. Check it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, my prediction came true. Now, if you were to ask, why did it come true? Why did the book levitate? Well, the answer is obvious. It's because I lifted it with my hand. All right, now bear with me. Now I'm going to make another prediction. Over the next 5 seconds, this book will not levitate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Once again, my prediction came true, but notice the difference this time. If you were to ask, why did it come true? Why did the book not levitate? That one's harder to answer. You could try to say, well, Steve, it's because you didn't lift it this time. But that's not really a satisfying answer. It's true that I didn't lift it, but it's equally true that Dan didn't lift it. This young lady or this gentleman here. To pick on any one of us and say, it was your failure to pick up the book that caused it not to levitate. Well, that doesn't really make sense. Isn't it more accurate to say, the book not levitating has no cause? All right? In fact, we can generalize this. Notice this is a negative statement. It's saying something didn't happen. So, what we can say is frequently a negative statement has no cause. That door didn't just open and close by itself. This projector didn't just turn off and on by itself, fortunately. So these are negative statements that have no cause. To put it another way, for this book, resting on the chair is natural. The book doesn't need a reason to continue resting on the chair. It would need a reason to do anything else. All right, so how does this relate to poverty? Well, we can observe that poverty, by its nature, is negative. It's saying you don't have enough money. Maybe you don't have a job, or if you do have a job, you didn't earn enough from it to get by. You didn't win the lottery. Okay, you didn't inherit a fortune. So a bunch of things didn't happen. So based on our previous discussion, we can say frequently poverty has no cause, in exactly the same way that this book, not levitating, has no cause. To put it another way, poverty is natural, in exactly the same way that for this book, resting on the chair is natural. Now, I'm going to guess that when people hear this statement, poverty is natural, many people are going to have an emotional reaction similar to the emotional reaction that folks in the 16th and 17th century had when they first heard the Copernican model. What? You mean we're not at the center of the universe? But we're human beings. We're made in God's image. We must be at the center of things. We must be the most important creature. But no. Copernicus was saying, sorry, but the Earth is revolving around the sun just like all the other planets. So cosmically speaking, we're not as important as we thought we were. And actually, it later turned out we're even less important because, the sun is just another star. The Milky Way is just another galaxy. So, it's a blow to our vanity, hence the emotional reaction. Now, in the case of poverty is natural, I think a lot of people would say, how could something so undesirable be natural? When something highly undesirable happens, there's a strong tendency to assign blame. So who do we usually blame for poverty? Libertarians like to blame the government, and the statists like to blame selfish, greedy, rich people, of course. So here I am coming along with this radical notion that no one is to blame. In most cases, poverty is not anyone's fault. It's just part of human nature. Okay. If poverty is natural, it stands to reason that prosperity, when you observe it, is an anomaly. So, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the United States, where our GDP per capita is the highest among the major countries. And it's, yes?
I didn't mean to stop your sentence, but before you go into that, you said poverty is something about human nature.
Yes.
My question was, is poverty only common to the human species? Do animals exhibit poverty?
That's a good question. Excellent question. I don't have an answer. I'll touch a little bit on that a little bit later. Not quite directly answering that, but sort of touching on it.
Okay.
Okay, now about this statement here. To be safe, I'm going to say among countries with population above 25 million. Because there are a bunch of small countries that beat us. But anyway, so it's natural to ask, where did our prosperity come from? Why is it that our prosperity is, how did it get to be so much more prosperous than other countries? All right, so one thing's for sure. As much as the government might like to take credit for our prosperity, the fact is that this region, which is now the United States, was actually quite prosperous by the standards of the day, long before this government even existed. All right, so the colonies actually had quite a vibrant economy. New England did a lot of shipbuilding. The middle colonies like Pennsylvania grew a lot of grains, and Virginia and the Carolinas produced a lot of tobacco, as you might expect. Total exports from the colonies grew by a factor of 12 over this 75-year period leading up to the Declaration of Independence. Now, to be fair, we need to correct for inflation. There was a little bit of inflation in the British pound. But after you correct for that, it's about a factor of 9, which is still pretty good. Visitors from Europe would say, hey, where are all your destitute people? You know, when we're visiting England, we're out on the road, we see beggars all over the place, but not here in the colonies, at least not nearly so much. And pretty much anyone who was able-bodied could find work. There was hardly any unemployment. And even though the population was growing very, very rapidly, the people maintained a fairly high standard of living. You know, I would actually argue that the Constitution that finally went into effect in 1789 was a result of New World prosperity, not the cause. If you look at people who were attending the Constitutional Convention, like Jared Ingersoll, Robert Morris, James Wilson, these people had businesses, successful businesses here in the New World, and I think they were at least trying to make sure that this new government would protect not only their own freedom, but the freedoms of their clients. Okay, so where did our prosperity come from then? There were a number of historical factors, but certainly one of the big factors was land. Ever since the 16th century, Europeans have been coming to the New World looking for cheap land. There was a historian by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner who wrote a thesis about the frontiers. It's called the Frontier Thesis. It's pretty famous. And he pointed out that throughout much of our history, including colonial history, we've had a frontier, and it's been a big part of our culture. So, you know, up until the early 18th century, the frontier was just East Coast. This was it. And then in the 19th century, it spread westward, of course. His angle on things was that it took a special kind of person to be a pioneer and settle in some place where, you know, it was a struggle to survive at first. And that this pioneer spirit kind of defined the American character. That was his thesis, basically. And I think he may have a point there. The point I'm making, though, is simply that that land had value. Okay, so if you acquired some frontier land, whether it was a reward for, you know, military service or just a reward for being a settler, that land had value. And then later, when the area was developed and civilization came in, that land had a lot of value. And people made fortunes in real estate. They really did. Now, it's true that there were frontiers elsewhere. Okay, pretty much all of North and South America was one big frontier. South Africa had its frontier. Australia had its frontier. But I think what made American frontier land especially attractive was several things. First, it was arable land. Much of it was suitable for growing corn. Much of it was suitable for growing wheat. This was very, very important prior to the Industrial Revolution. The temperate climate, at least in the northern part of the country. And I only mention that because if you look around the world at which countries are doing really well, or at least even relatively well, economically, there's a pretty strong correlation between that and the temperate climate. Just as an example, look at Europe today. What are the countries in Europe that are kind of not doing so well? Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, the ones with subtropical climate. And I don't know if it's just that all that hot weather makes people not work so hard, or whatever. I don't know exactly what it is, because there's quite a correlation there. Now, it's true that the southern part of the United States does have a subtropical climate, but in the case of Virginia and the Carolinas, that actually worked out well because that's just the climate that is needed for tobacco. Okay, and then finally, just proximity to Europe. All other things being equal, I think settlers would rather settle someplace that's just, across the pond, so to speak, rather than half a world away. Easier to get there in the first place, easier to get back to England if it doesn't work out, which it frequently didn't, and then just easier to trade with Europe. Okay, and obviously the frontier ended at some point. Actually, what motivated Turner to write his thesis was he was afraid that with the frontier vanishing, that we would lose our pioneer spirit. And he may have something there. But again, the point I'm simply making is that the economic benefit of the frontier land, although it was very large, it was finite, and by the end of the 19th century, it was starting to wind down. All right, the Industrial Revolution, I'll just briefly go through this. It started in Britain, and then it spread to Western Europe, and also to the United States. Where the period of time where the U.S. really had its rapid expansion was in the last half of the 19th century. So this is sometimes called the Second Industrial Revolution. It's when steel started getting manufactured in bulk. The railroads were put in. This is the time when the internal combustion engine was just getting invented. The automobile was just getting started. So what helped out the United States there? Well, obviously, it was plentiful land. There was still a frontier at that point. As a matter of fact, the railroads helped settlers move out west to help settle the frontier, but also other, a bunch of natural resources. We have lots of iron ore. We have lots of, crude oil, and especially coal. Even today, the United States has the largest known reserves of coal. Okay, so how about today? Where the frontier is pretty much gone. We're not really a manufacturing leader anymore, and yet our GDP is high, and I think it's artificially high. It's too high, and what makes it artificially high is the several things, but it starts with the monetary base. This, as I'm sure most of you know, is where the Federal Reserve truly creates money out of thin air. This is all money created out of thin air, okay? And you can see that it's growing. Not only is it growing exponentially, but it's growing faster than inflation. So, 7%, whereas here, the exception is the late 70s and the early 80s, where inflation was actually higher. But for all the rest of the years, the monetary base is growing about double the rate of inflation, at least as measured by CPI. And these last 10 years, as I'm sure you're aware, with quantitative easing, we've been growing the monetary base at 15 and 20%, while inflation has only been 1 or 2%. So to me, that's remarkable. you know, I guess part of it is that the U.S., the dollar is the world's reserve currency, so there's an artificial demand for dollars. But still, this is pretty remarkable. And I don't know how much longer they can keep it up. But one thing that's interesting to do here is compare this with other countries. So here are just the various monetary bases. And you can see that just on an absolute scale, our monetary base is, I believe it's more than all the others combined. But even on a per capita basis, I always like to express things on a per capita basis. But what you could say is that on a per capita basis, we are the second best magicians around behind Switzerland. But anyway, so well, I think that speaks for itself. Okay, so you know, we talk about the monetary base, but where does that really show up? And it shows up in debt. We have exponentially growing debt, and you know, people talk a lot about the federal debt, which is, you know, down here, 12 trillion. This is not even counting the other 5 trillion that's the government owns. This is just the publicly held debt. But this is just one piece of the pie here. I mean, there's another almost 3 trillion of state and local government. Businesses have, you know, another 11 trillion, and the household sector, 13 trillion. That's just everything from, you know, home mortgages to credit card debt, just everything. And so it's adding up to a total here for the domestic non-financial of almost 40 trillion debt as of 2013. And whenever I see big numbers like this, I always like to express it as a per capita. So here's all that same data on a per capita basis. So, you know, we have almost 40,000 per capita of federal debt, a little over 40,000 per capita of household debt, and you know, with everything else, it adds up to 125,000 per capita. So how long can we keep this up? I don't know. But so just to summarize here, why the U.S. is as prosperous as it is. Historically, I think frontier land is a very underappreciated reason why we've historically been prosperous. We also have natural resources, especially coal, but today our prosperity is like a veneer of prosperity. It's artificial, it's not sustainable, and it's based on exponentially growing monetary base, exponentially growing debt. Okay, with that somewhat long-winded introduction, we come to, this is the controversial part. Okay?
Steve,
yes?
how does debt make us prosperous?
Okay. The usual measure, or one of the measures of prosperity is GDP. That is, how much retail sales are you getting? And, you know, the very act of borrowing money doesn't by itself count as economic activity, but it leads to economic activity that wouldn't have otherwise happened.
Okay.
All right? Gotcha. All right, so this is my hypothesis, my very controversial hypothesis. I call it the net consumption hypothesis, and it says, in the economic sense, people tend to consume more than they produce despite their best efforts and good intentions. So net consumption just means consuming more than one produces. Over the next several slides, I'm going to be restating this in a number of different ways, but what I want to emphasize at this point is, if you can accept this one premise, the net consumption hypothesis, it would explain the phenomenon of poverty, and therefore, by the principle of Occam's razor, it's worthy of serious consideration. Now, of course, it's just a hypothesis, it's not proven by any means, but it merits serious consideration because it would explain why poverty is so pervasive and so persistent, and has been for thousands of years, and also why in developed countries like the US, people have so much debt. Okay, so let's take a closer look.
So this relates then to that large debt?
Yes.
Because of the consumption beyond our needs?
Right. Okay, so what it comes down to is people need a lot. Human beings need an awful lot. We need food, obviously. And unlike, so maybe we can talk, okay, this is sort of a comparison with other animals. Other species can subsist on a relatively simple diet, whereas we need just the right mix of proteins, vitamins, minerals, and so on. And so it's actually quite difficult for one person or even a family to meet all of their dietary needs through their own farming. I believe most farmers end up purchasing at least part of their diet from outside. Shelter, again, unlike many species, we need shelter from the elements. I guess, well, that may be partly because we have less fur than other mammals. I don't know. And of course, healthcare. When you think about it, our bodies are amazingly resilient, given how complex they are, and the fact that they often last more than 70 years, but they do need a little like tune-up now and then, and that's where healthcare comes in. Okay, so economically, what is it that we need? Well, of course there's land and there's raw materials, but I want to focus on labor. We need the labor of others. We depend on other people to do labor for us, and I call it life-sustaining labor. Okay, so farmers grow our food, truck drivers transport the food from where it's mass-produced to where it's needed. Carpenters, plumbers, and electricians build our homes and then later repair them as needed. And doctors and nurses and so on provide the health care. And there are other examples of life-sustaining labor, but these are some of the most obvious. Okay, so what the hypothesis is most people don't do enough useful work to earn this life-sustaining labor in a free market. So in other words, most people couldn't survive a truly free market for life-sustaining labor. Now, I want to point out two things because I can't emphasize them enough. First, this is not a new thing. It's not that society has decayed to this point. It's been this way, it's part of human nature, it's been this way for thousands of years. Now, some of the occupations are new, obviously electrician, truck driver and so on, but you get the idea. The other thing is, it's not an issue of laziness. Okay? Now, some people, of course, are lazy, but I think in most cases, it's just the person lacks any sufficiently useful talent or skill to be able to earn this life-sustaining labor. Now, one of the challenges with this particular formulation of the hypothesis is it involves comparing the labor of one person against the labor of the value of one person's labor against the value of the life-sustaining labor that he depends on, and it's very difficult to value labor objectively. So this next formulation of the hypothesis doesn't talk about the value of labor, at least not directly. It takes more of a macroscopic view. So this formulation says, you know that emigration that happened in Atlas Shrugged? It wasn't just because society was messed up or corrupt or whatever. It's saying the potential for this exists in any society. So, or at least any typical society. So in any typical society, there's going to be a minority subgroup who, if they could just segregate themselves and go off to some Galt culture place, they would be better off. They would be economically better off. And the remainder, which is the majority, would be worse off. In fact, their economy would be collapsing. So, just a little bit about why this is. People are different. People, some people are stronger than others, some people are more agile than others, some people are more intelligent than others, some people are more talented in all kinds of ways. And the differences from one individual to another are very big. It's like the distribution of ability is not even at all. It's not even close to even. Some people are just much better. So for any particular job that needs to be done, some people are just much, much better suited to it than others. And actually another way that you can be a net consumer, even if you have a marketable talent and you're gainfully employed, if you have something like an addiction problem, you're addicted to drugs or alcohol and you engage in destructive behavior. So even if you're gainfully employed, you can still be a substantial net drain on your whatever society you're part of. So what the hypothesis, yes?
How do you define collapse when you say the economy of the remaining people would collapse? What does that mean?
Well, basically what it means is that whoever's left would just have a really, really tough time getting done all the life-sustaining labor that needs to be done.
They wouldn't die, it would just be...
I think they would basically starve to death because they wouldn't be able to do all that life-sustaining labor, the farming and the truck transporting, they would have trouble getting that done because they're the less able people.
At least the quality of life would be reduced.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to know, if collapse meant just annihilation or just,
I guess, you know, the picture described in Atlas Shrugged is, well, I think it would involve death, I really do.
okay.
But, you know, not an immediate sudden thing, it would be just a gradual, people would be starving to death. So, you know, you might ask, well, why doesn't this immigration happen? I think it started to. I think, you know, in frontier lands, frontier settlements, I think Turner may have had a point when he said it took a special kind of person to be a pioneer and move to settle one of these areas where it was a struggle to survive and, you know, to transform a wilderness area into a place that you can actually live in. I think, I don't have any data to go on, but I think those frontier settlements had a higher than usual proportion of what I'm calling net producers. So it was kind of like the beginnings of a Galt's Gulch. But anyway, so what are the practical challenges to make such a thing happen? One of the biggest is recognizing net producers. I mean, in our very controlled, unfree labor market, it's very, very hard to tell who's a net consumer. I mean, I don't know myself I don't know whether I'm a net consumer or a net producer, much less whether other people are, because it's so hard to tell. The only way to know is to put people in a truly free market and see how they survive over time. The second point, this is, I think, was a major theme of Atlas Shrugged, that, you know, the people who probably should have or would have been able to move felt guilty about it and felt it kind of like an obligation to stay behind and somehow make it work. And then, of course, there's how do you keep the net consumers out of where this Galt's Gulch, wherever it may be. All right, so this third one, formulation. And this is my favorite because it's not just a binary yes or no, true or false thing. It's saying where we are on a continuum. So it's saying in a sustainable colonial society, the charity demand rate is more than 100%. So I'm going to define all these a bit later. But the point is, if you disagree with this, the question still remains, okay then, what is the charity demand rate? And I would encourage you guys to think about this, regardless of how you feel about the net consumption hypothesis, regardless of your political views, think a little bit about what is the charity demand rate, or what would it be in a sustainable society. Okay, so let me define some terms here. We do no time. We should be okay. A society is sustainable if, this is about what you would expect, if the society can continue doing what it's doing for the foreseeable future without running out of something or becoming unstable. So examples of things that, in my opinion, are not sustainable: deficit spending. I don't think we can keep doing that forever. Quantitative easing, obviously. Clonable. A society is clonable if some other society could clone or adopt the model of this society and achieve similar success. So in other words, what it's saying is the success of this society doesn't depend on anything special about this region or this group of people. So examples of non-clonable society. Norway, you all know that Norway is one of those tiny countries that has even higher GDP per capita than the United States. And the reason is that it has so much oil. If some other society tried to adopt the Norwegian model but didn't have those big oil reserves, I don't think it would work nearly as well. And then, of course, in the Galt's Gulch, you have the unusual population mix, so that's not going to be clonable either. All right, charity demand rate. I actually did an Ignite talk on this last year, so I'm reusing some of the slides here. So here we have a small society with their incomes arranged in increasing order. The blue line is this, what you need to get by, the cost of living, basic needs. The green is, anything above that is discretionary income. And the folks on the left are not getting by, so the red area shows how much more they would need just to get by. So the charity demand rate is the red as a percentage of the green, and the significance, so it's the charity demand divided by total discretionary income. And the significance of this number is if all of these people donated that percentage of their discretionary income, it would be enough to cover all the legitimately needy people. And welfare.
Wait.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. So did you just, so all of the green they would have to donate or give to the,
So let's say that this is 30% of this, which maybe it looks like anybody. Then what's that saying is, if all of these people donated 30% of their income to charity, it would be enough to take care of these people.
I see, okay.
Okay.
But what would be the incentive for those people to not need charity? Why wouldn't they just say, okay, I'm giving 30%, I'm just going to sit here and collect 30%?
The assumption here is it's legitimate charity. If people are just gaming the system, then it's not supposed to count that. It should be that they legitimately need it. So it's trying to measure, it's not hard to measure, of course, because it's hard to tell who really is needy versus who is just gaming the system. But in principle, that's what this charity demand rate is. Okay, so I had gone through I'm going to go through this pretty fast. I had just gone through an estimate of what it might be approximately for the year 2012 in the United States. I made a bunch of assumptions which are probably wildly off anyway, but I came up with 23%. And the point here is the only reason it's that low is that we're doing all this money printing. The monetary base is growing and then the debt is growing. And if that were to ever stop, what we're predicting here, what I'm predicting is that that number would shoot way up, above 100%. So, to help, it's useful to compare the charity demand rate with the generosity rate. So this is the total amount of people who are willing to donate as a percentage of their discretionary income. So if everyone will donate 40% of their income, then the generosity rate is 40%. And so we can compare these two numbers here. The charity demand rate compared to the generosity rate. There are kind of three possibilities here. This first one, I think, at least I assume, this is the standard libertarian view, that it's less than the generosity rate, which means that private charity would be enough to take care of all the legitimately needy people. So the next possibility is that the charity demand rate is higher, but still less than 100%. So I think this is the statist view, at least if they thought through what they were saying. So they might be saying, a statist might say, well, the generosity rate is 40%, but the charity demand rate is 60%, and therefore we need welfare programs and associated taxes in order to squeeze that last 20% out of those selfish, greedy rich people, right? So, and then the third possibility, which is my very dark pessimistic view, is that it's something more than 100%. Which means that even if everyone donated their entire discretionary income, it still wouldn't be enough to take care of all legitimate, not people gaming the system, but the legitimately needy people. Okay. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, Steve, how could this possibly be true? Surely the world economy would have collapsed if people were net consuming so much throughout history. My hypothesis, well, okay, one thing's for sure. When you have this kind of net consumption, eventually something's got to give. And one thing that obviously can give is that net consumers can die off. Okay, so, you know, if you're a believer in Darwin's theory of evolution, you know, a net consumer is just kind of like a special case of an unfit person. And of course, evolution implies death. And so what I'm hypothesizing here is basically that evolution was happening up until about the time of the Industrial Revolution. Since then, well, yeah, I kind of want to get through other things. So basically what I'm saying is that in poor countries, this is still happening. I think there's a lot of death happening in poor countries. I think that much is clear. In rich countries, and this is pretty much all of them, but especially the United States, governments have taken a variety of unsustainable measures that they've had the effect of masking this net consumption. And you know, some examples are deficit spending, and then of course this exponentially growing debt. And okay, I'm just going to go really quickly through this. I know this is not the slide from hell. I was trying to make it simple, but. All right, so this is a hypothetical example. We're in an alternate universe where people's dietary needs are much simpler. There's blue biscuits and there's green biscuits, and everybody needs to just eat one blue biscuit and one green biscuit every day. And so Alice owns the blue company and hires Bob to make 10 blue biscuits a day, and Fred hires Gail in the green company to make 10 green biscuits a day, which is just what this community needs. And then the rest of the people here, Kathy, Dan, Edith, Hugh, Irene, and Joe, they're making a luxury item of some kind. The nature of it doesn't matter. It can be like, designer clothes or designer handbags or something. The key point is that neither Dan nor Gail have any interest, neither Bob nor Gail have any interest in this luxury item. They're kind of saying to themselves, well, why would any sane person buy this thing? But they do, and that's the power of marketing. Anyway, but they're paying for it with debt. So these two companies have gotten into like a routine where one day Alice will borrow a bunch of money, use it to pay her employees, who then buy these luxury items from from Fred, who then is able to pay his employees, and there's still enough money left over for him to pay the debt that he took out yesterday, the loan that he took out yesterday. And the way that's working is every day it's 10% higher. So basically all these numbers, it's kind of like an alternating Groundhog Day. Every day is the mirror image of the previous day, except that all the dollar amounts are 10% higher. So, so like on Tuesday, Alice is borrowing $10.93, and the next day, Wednesday, Fred is borrowing $1,300 and something. Anyway, so we have basically an inflation rate of 10% a day here. And if you look at this from the bank's point of view, the bank sees that Alice is every other day borrowing some money, and every other day it's actually 21% more, but yet on the odd days, Alice always pays off her debt. And the way she does it is because on that day, Fred is taking out a loan. And it's 10% higher, and it's going through the economy, and it's allowing Alice to pay off her debt. So from the bank's point of view, Alice is a good credit risk. She always pays off her debt. And this thing is actually sustainable as long as the bank is willing to keep lending, 10% more every day. So, of course, at some point, the bank will probably stop and say, maybe they'll hit a reserve limit or something. And at that point, we'll have to say, all right, Alice, I can't give you the loan. And that will be bad, not just for Alice, but for everybody here, because she won't be able to pay her employees, who won't be able to purchase these luxury items, and that will mean that Fred won't be able to pay off his loan, so he'll go bankrupt too. So that's one way that it can collapse. Another way is, the key point here is Kathy, Dan, Edith, and Hugh, Irene, and Joe. They're consuming biscuits, but they're not producing anything that the biscuit makers need or even want. So another way that this can become unstable is if Bob talks directly to his counterpoint Gail and says, hey, if the two of us were to move off to Galt's Gulch, things would be better for us. We'd have, between the two of us, we would have the biscuit making skills to sustain ourselves. In fact, we could take it easy. Instead of having to make 10 biscuits a day, we could just make 2 a day, and we'd have more free time and so on. So this is just an example of how exponentially growing debt can lead to obviously higher GDP because it's artificial, and also it can serve to mask net consumption. Okay, this will be my final slide here. I'm looking forward to Bitcoin because it's going to be a test of my net consumption hypothesis. The thing about Bitcoin is the monetary base. It will not grow. That's what's so great about Bitcoin. Bankers can't just create it out of thin air. It can't grow exponentially. In fact, it can't grow at all. It grows through mining up to the limit of 21 million. And this is going to be a new experience for people. Today, if you're starting a business or you're growing your business and you need to get a loan, you just go to the bank and they more or less just print up the money for you. And that's only a slight exaggeration. if Bitcoin ever goes mainstream, they can't do that, okay? So loans are going to be a lot harder to get. Because, if the bank wants to loan you money, they're going to have to loan you their own hard-earned Bitcoin. So it's going to be a lot harder. I think it's going to feel like a recession. It's going to feel like the mother of all recessions. And the hypothesis here is that that's going to cause a huge surge in the charity demand rate. It's going to go up above 100%. Now, if that doesn't happen, if after we've gone to Bitcoin mainstream, 5 years later, either it'll become glaringly obvious that the charity demand rates are going up, or everything will be just fine, and you guys will come back to me and say, this proves that the net consumption hypothesis is not true, and you'll be right, and I will be thrilled. I hope that I'm wrong. Okay, that's it. There's time for a little bit of questions. If
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Mine is just a technical thing.
Okay.
It's almost absurd. Does not levitate mean to rise without
Oh,
any...
you're okay. Maybe technically this was not levitating. Okay,
yeah,
all right.
That was the only thing.
Okay, all right. Okay. All right, well, thank you all for coming. And,
if you fly over the U.S.,
Yeah.
from coast to coast, there's tremendous amounts of land that are just sitting there vacant. It's like we aren't out of land or anything.
I believe it's
It's
all
probably-
owned. It's all owned though, and
Well, the federal government may own it, but it's vacant land.
okay.
Compared to, if you look at where civilization is, where the settlements are, they're relatively small compared to where there's
Right.
no...
It is certainly true that the population density is still quite a bit lower here in the United States than it is in, say, either Europe or China. So we still have a little bit of an advantage there.
Thank you, Steve.